Well, for every day of Donald Trump's almost 78 years of life, FBI agents have carried guns everywhere they go. But Donald Trump is now pretending that he didn't know that. No one insults the intelligence of Trump voters more than Donald Trump. And I am sure that most voters who vote for Donald Trump are smarter than Donald Trump. And they vote for Donald Trump simply because they hate taxes as much as he does, or they think abortion is murder. But the people who send money to Trump, who are a tiny, tiny percentage of Trump voters, really must be every bit as stupid as Donald Trump insists that they are. Because today, Donald Trump is raising money from those poor people who should know better but don't by sending an email saying, "Breaking from Trump, Biden's DOJ was authorized to shoot me!" Exclamation point. It's just been revealed that Biden's DOJ was authorized to use deadly force for their despicable raid in Mar-a-Lago. You know, they're just itching to do the unthinkable. Joe Biden was locked and loaded, ready to take me out and put my family in danger. Okay. None of the dangerously stupid people who send money to Donald Trump in response to that email know that the FBI scheduled the serving of the search warrant at that Florida location when they knew for a fact that no one named Trump was actually there. They did it in the summer when Trump served thousands of miles away in cooler climates, in Donald Trump's case, in New Jersey. Donald Trump told those lies about deadly force to his stupidest supporters because this standard piece of paper right here, this piece of paper, was attached to the filings for the search warrant that the FBI executed, through which they found Donald Trump in criminal possession of classified documents at his Florida home. This piece of paper is the FBI's policy statement on the use of deadly force. This piece of paper is part of the filings of every search warrant obtained by the FBI. That means this very same piece of paper was in the filings in the search warrant that the FBI executed at Joe Biden's summer home in the FBI's investigation of Joe Biden's possible possession of classified material, an investigation with which Joe Biden fully cooperated from the start and was found to have done nothing wrong. Now, those poor Trump voters who send money to Donald Trump because of things like this piece of paper will never know that that same piece of paper was in the Joe Biden search warrant file. And this piece of paper is simply a recitation of the FBI rules on the use of deadly force. In the early decades of the FBI, they didn't have any rules on the use of deadly force. Police forces didn't either. When I wrote a book about police use of deadly force in the 1980s, most American police departments then did not have a rule about police use of deadly force. But now almost all police departments have a rule that is virtually identical to this FBI rule. This list of rules tells FBI agents not to fire at moving vehicles, as do most police department rules on deadly force. It prohibits warning shots. The very first rule listed says deadly force may not be used solely to prevent the escape of a fleeing suspect. That rule was forced on the FBI and on all American police departments by a Supreme Court decision in 1985. So that's all this piece of paper is. The FBI rules and restrictions on the use of deadly force, which is part of the filing of every FBI search warrant. The very next page of the filings for this search warrant specifically indicates that Donald Trump would not be at that location when the search warrant is executed. And so, no one changed the rules that day so that the FBI agents could just shoot Donald Trump. But Donald Trump knows that he has some supporters, a tiny group of them, who are so hopelessly stupid, he can tell them that the FBI, quote, was authorized to shoot me. And they'll believe it. Not only will they believe it, they will send him money They will send money to the man who told them when he began running for president that he was so rich he would never ask for anyone's money. Now think about the layers of stupidity that are right there, the layers of stupidity it takes to respond to that Donald Trump email and send him money. That is the money Donald Trump uses to pay his criminal defense lawyers who assembled in Florida today for hearings in the courtroom of Donald Trump's favorite judge, the one he appointed, Aileen Mercedes Cannon, who once again cast herself in the role of federal judge who forgot to go to law school, which would be funny if the stakes weren't what they are. Judge Cannon had hearings on issues that most other federal judges could handle without even having a hearing. Judge Cannon does everything she can to appear, at least, to be a functioning ally of Donald Trump's in the Trump attempt to delay his trial for violations of the Espionage Act and illegal possession of classified material until long after the presidential election. Judge Cannon's first hearing of the day today was on Trump co-defendant Walt Nauta's motion to dismiss the case against him, saying it was a selective prosecution because not everyone who moved boxes for Donald Trump was charged with a crime. Walt Nauta's lawyer neglected to mention that not everyone who moved boxes lied to the FBI about moving boxes for Donald Trump. The second hearing Judge Cannon held was on a motion by both Donald Trump and Walt Nauta to dismiss the case, claiming alleged procedural failures in the indictment. Desperate criminal defense lawyers file motions like this all the time, but rarely are they granted significant amounts of time by the court to argue those motions and slow down progress toward a trial. Judge Beryl Howell presided over the Washington, D.C. grand jury that Special Prosecutor Jack Smith used for most of his investigation of Donald Trump's violations of the Espionage Act and illegal possession of classified documents. This week, an opinion by Judge Howell granting Jack Smith the right to subpoena a lawyer who worked for Donald Trump on that case was unsealed with the name of the lawyer redacted and a few other redactions in it. And that opinion justifies an exception to the attorney-client privilege and allows that testimony by the lawyer. Judge Howell found, quote, strong evidence that the former president intended to hide boxes from his attorney's search efforts to comply with the grand jury subpoena and resultantly unlawfully to retain any classified documents contained inside of the boxes purposely removed from the attorney's search. Judge Howell noted that Trump defense attorneys discovered 4 documents marked classified in Donald Trump's bedroom after the FBI served their search warrant. The judge wrote, quote, notably, no excuse is provided as to how the former president could miss the classified marked documents found in his own bedroom at Mar-a-Lago. Instead, the government has provided evidence to demonstrate that the full arc of the criminal violation had already concluded more than 6 months before this search of Mar-a-Lago, when the evidence demonstrates that the former president intentionally failed to provide all of the classified documents in his possession to the government with the June 3rd, 2022 certification. Judge Howell described what happened when Donald Trump must have realized that security camera video would show the boxes being moved, quote, after a phone call with the former president and on the same day as service of the government's subpoena for Mar-a-Lago security footage from the area around the storage room, Walt Nauta rearranged his travel to fly to West Palm Beach the following day, falsely telling his colleagues that the change in plans was for personal reasons. Within 2 hours of landing in Florida, Walt Nauta and a witness entered the storage room, and a witness can be seen gesturing toward the camera. This scramble to Mar-a-Lago in the wake of the June 24th, 2022 phone call reflects the former president's realization that the removal of the boxes from the storage room before search was captured on camera, and his attempts to ensure that any subsequent movement of the boxes back to the storage room could occur off camera. This theory draws support from the curious absence of any video footage showing the return of the remaining boxes to the storage room, which necessarily occurred at some point between June 3rd, 2022, when the room had approximately X number of boxes, according to FBI agents, and the execution of the search warrant on August 8th, 2022, when the agents counted 73 boxes. Newly unsealed photographs of Donald Trump's co-defendant, Walt Nauta, show Walt Nauta moving boxes after those boxes were under subpoena. That's the equivalent of bank video showing you the bank robber at work. Those are the images Donald Trump allegedly tried to have erased from the security camera video. On the day when President Biden got his 200th federal judge confirmed by the Senate, another flag was found flying over another home of a Supreme Court justice, signifying full support for Donald Trump's attempt to illegally overturn the last presidential election and for the violent horde of Trump supporters who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, just across the street from the workplace of Supreme Court justices. And this second flag was owned by the same Supreme Court justice who got caught last week with the first flag. Last week, the New York Times reported that Justice Samuel Alito, who was appointed by George W. Bush, remember, not Donald Trump, George W. Bush, was caught flying the American flag upside down at his home in suburban Virginia, a short drive from the United States Supreme Court. Today, the New York Times reported that Justice Samuel Alito, who was appointed by George W. Bush, say that again, not Trump, George W. Bush, has been flying another flag at his summer home in New Jersey. That flag says, "Appeal to Heaven." The Times reports this time it was the Appeal to Heaven flag, which, like the inverted U.S. flag, was carried by rioters at the Capitol on January 6th. Also known as the Pine Tree flag, it dates back to the Revolutionary War, but largely fell into obscurity until recent years and is now a symbol of support for former President Donald J. Trump for a religious strand of the Stop the Steal campaign and for a push to remake American government in Christian terms. Justice Alito, who, let me remind you, was appointed by George W. Bush, declined to respond to questions about that flag at his vacation home after blaming his wife for turning their American flag upside down at their other home, telling the New York Times last week, "I had no involvement whatsoever in the flying of the flag. It was briefly placed by Mrs. Alito in response to a neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs." Good luck making sense of that. Only in the perversions of Samuel Alito's brain does it make perfect sense that when your neighbor bothers you, your wife, of course, turns your American flag upside down. We have all known that it is an outrage that the most corrupted judge in the history of the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, has not recused himself from cases involving Donald Trump and has brought that Donald Trump has brought to the Supreme Court, trying to get immunity for his illegal attempts to overthrow the presidential election. Clarence Thomas's wife supported every one of those illegal attempts by Donald Trump to overturn that election. But now we know Samuel Alito is in full violation of the Judicial Code of Ethics for federal judges that would apply to any other judge, because Samuel Alito should also be recused from any case involving Donald Trump in any way. No member of the United States Senate in history has done more to expose scandal and structural unfairness at the Supreme Court than our next guest. Joining us now is Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. He is a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He chairs the subcommittee on federal courts. He is also the author of The Scheme: How the Right Wing Used Dark Money to Capture the Supreme Court. Senator Whitehouse, thank you very much for joining us. Of course, it wouldn't be just one flag. One flag was bad enough, but here we are again.
Here we are again. It's not enough to be a Supreme Court justice flying one MAGA battle flag at your house. You got to have two houses and fly two MAGA battle flags, one at each house. It is stunning. And it's the kind of thing, as you know, that from anybody else would provoke an investigation. And all we get from Justice Alito are self-serving statements on Fox News, which is a forum in which you can lie with impunity. You can make it up. It's not an official statement that would be subject to sanctions if you didn't tell the truth. And now he won't answer at all about MAGA Battle Flag 2. So it really encapsulates all of the problems that we've had with this rogue Supreme Court and its refusal to accept any rule of law.
The chairman of your Senate Judiciary Committee, Dick Durbin, says Justice Alito must recuse himself immediately from cases related to the 2020 election and the January 6th insurrection. He also calls on the Chief Justice to see how this is damaging the court and immediately enact an enforceable code of conduct. Recusal used to be something that you could reasonably rely on Supreme Court justices to use with wisdom. It was rarely used and rarely required, but used often enough that we could see it as something that worked, but not anymore.
No, and one interesting feature of the recusal requirement is that it is a law passed by Congress, specifically applicable to Supreme Court justices. So when they pay no attention to it, they are actually violating statutory law. This is not one of these rules that the Supreme Court or the judicial branch come up with for themselves, where they might say, well, this is just judicial stuff. You legislators, you just run along here. No, this is the law of the land passed by Congress, and they're just flouting it.
Can the Senate Judiciary Committee demand testimony from Justice Alito or Justice Thomas?
They have been very reluctant to, and they wave separation of powers fan dances around to try to prevent us from speaking to them. But I think it has gotten to the point where the Chief Justice is going to have to engage. And I think you'll see some more action on that shortly out of the Judiciary Committee. And I think the Judicial Conference is also can be expected to engage further. That, as you recall, is the panel of senior federal judges that oversees the judicial branch of government and has authority to look into things like whether disclosures were unlawful and willful and whether there is violation of judicial ethics norms.
The reason I kept repeating that George W. Bush appointed Samuel Alito is I fear that too many people can think this is a problem created by Donald Trump. Every Republican president of our lifetimes has appointed someone to at least one justice to the Supreme Court who has done serious damage to the way we live and has tried to do more damage to the way we live, from Clarence Thomas by the first President Bush. And this notion that this was something that has just blossomed during Trump is something that you've worked very hard to expose even before the Trump justices took their seats.
No, you're right. This goes way back. The person responsible for the appointment of Justice Alito was actually Leonard Leo, the operative of the Koch brothers and the creepy billionaires who have been meddling in the court. You remember that Bush originally wanted to appoint his legal counsel, his friend, his fellow Texan conservative woman lawyer to replace Sandra Day O'Connor, Harriet Miers. And he got attacked not by Democrats for that. He got attacked from these far-right billionaires. And he humiliatingly had to withdraw his own legal counsel's nomination. And Leo produced the agreeable justice to the creepy billionaires, none other than Sam Alito.